A little while ago, a friend of mine asked me to do some sound work for an animation that he was working on, and so I thought this might be a good time to try out that sound design and process video format that I mentioned earlier. I know I said that I was gonna do that with Critical Role, and I'm still planning on doing that, it's just that this happened first, so I'm gonna make a video on this first. Plus, the animation is still based on his D&D character, so yeah. Let's start with a little bit of background. This is Delta, a Water Genasi and our D&D party's resident Cleric Artificer multiclass played by Will, also known as SerialArtistry.
I'm gonna Jeff the kill you.
That guy. Delta is a spellcaster that mostly sticks to the light domain of clerical spells, but how he gets his power is a little bit unorthodox. He gained access to divine magic by abusing a loophole in a holy text that he found and used his skills as an artificer to focus that power into usable spells. He's basically doing the equivalent of getting a free trial for something and continually re-upping it without actually ever paying for it. Interestingly, the deity that this power comes from actually knows about this, but just lets him keep doing it, partially because he approves of what Delta's doing with the power, but also just because he thinks it's funny. He kind of just lets Delta do his thing so long as he's still doing good with the power. So yeah, anyway. This isn't exactly your typical cleric, and this is no better illustrated than by how he casts his favorite spell at the moment, Guiding Bolt, or as he likes to call it, his, Special Beam Attack. Guiding Bolt is a first-level cleric spell where the caster makes a spell attack and shoots out a flash of light at their target. If it hits, it does a good chunk of damage and also lights the target up like a beacon. This grants advantage for the next attack that anybody makes against it. It's a very solid spell for both damage and support, and arguably scales really well even into the super high levels. Delta casts Guiding Bolt a little bit differently though. He does it through his Ersatz Eye, and it manifests in the form of a huge release of Siphon Divine Energy, or a special beam, if you will. Just imagine it like Kano from Mortal Kombat doing his eye laser thing. It's basically that. And that's what he did an animation for, so that's what I'm gonna be designing a sound for. Should be pretty fun. Hello, yes, it's me, SoundSmith from the future, editing this video. I'm just here to let you know that Will also made a process video for his part of this fun little project, the animation, so if you're interested in learning more about how this was made, then click the link in the description. Yeah, okay, back to the video. I'm gonna break this whole animation down into the different elements I'll need to design just to make approaching this a little bit easier. We've got the beam itself. Duh, this is the body of our sound. We've got sweeteners, which is stuff like whooshes, kick drums, and tails that help sweeten the design. A mech layer, which is basically any mechanical sounds coming from the eye, like switching it on or rattling around during the beam. And finally, we're gonna add any additional Foley that we might need, which is just simple stuff, like footsteps or the sound of his armor moving around. So let's start with the meat and potatoes of this design, the special beam. I not only want this to sound good, but also be complex and sound notably different from what you'd expect a standard level 1 cleric spell to sound like. Like, yeah, okay, that's about what you'd expect, but it's also kinda boring. Delta is also an artificer and is using this divine power through less than legitimate means. It's a pretty complex way of casting, and I want it to sound more interesting than just holy light powered thing. So how do we do that? Well, sound design is a lot like fashion design in that if you need something to be more interesting, you just add a bunch of extra layers. And Decapitator, because you put this on everything, don't lie. We're gonna have 3 main layers to this beam, and I want each one to represent an element of how Delta casts. The first layer is going to be that tonal, clerical, holy light part. It is still a cleric spell, so it should still be in the final design. The second one will probably be a more sci-fi-ish tonal element to represent the artificer part, and for the third one, I'd like to add some extra power to the beam. Some kind of rough, uncontrolled, distorted sound to really drive home how this is potentially dangerous, ramshackle, DIY divine power. Okay, enough talking, let's make some noise. For the divine layer, we want a more magic, shimmery texture with lots of high-end frequencies. To get this specific sound, I'm gonna shamelessly steal a technique from Juan Pablo Uribe, a sound designer at Bungie. Sorry if I totally butchered your name, by the way. By using a couple delay plugins and this really neat one called Valhalla Shimmer, you can take normal ring-out sounds like this and turn them into something like this. This is also how I made that really basic sound earlier in the video. But yeah, this should give us that divine magic feel that we're looking for. But that being said, I'd also like this to have some more complicated tonal elements in it, just to really hammer home that this isn't a normal guiding bolt. So in order to do that, we're gonna need a more complicated ringing sound to run through the plugins. So how might we get a more complicated ring out? Well, hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to Sound Design with SoundSmith, where today we are going to be dropping a bunch of metal pipes on the ground. Cool, that should work. Let's run that through Juan's effects chain and see what we get. Awesome. I also slapped a few extra effects on there, like a flanger and some filtering just to give us some more movement, and now we have a pretty good sounding divine texture to layer into the beam. Next, let's tackle that sci-fi layer. This one is a bit more straightforward. Lots of sci-fi stuff is made using synthesizers, but I actually want this to sound a little bit more organic since we're still talking fantasy and not full-on sci-fi. So instead of a synthesizer, I opted to use a more electrical sound, specifically a sample from an industrial soldering station. Same deal as before, I added a few effects to add some movement along with some extra drive, and now we've got this. Nice. The last main layer for the beam itself is the one that I want to sound powerful, gritty, and rough. So the first thing that came to my mind was sandpaper. I went through my collection of recordings and sample libraries and settled on this sound of a large rock being dragged across a piece of sandpaper. I really like this sample because it sounds like the rock gets stuck a bit when it's first starting to be dragged. So if I put a low pass filter on that and sweep it up, we get this really cool lead in that sounds like the beam is sputtering to life. Exactly what we want for this layer. And now that we've got that set up, let's just mangle the shit out of it with distortion and a bunch of other stuff. We do want this to sound unkempt and rough, so I really just fucking destroyed the sound, but it ended up sounding pretty cool, so hey. Now we just gotta bring all of these together and make them sound like they're all a part of the same beam. And to do that, we're gonna use the sound designer equivalent of an Instagram filter. I know that sounds like a joke, but I'm actually being serious here. If you do the same thing over the top of a bunch of different things, it makes it look like they were together the whole time. You see this idea used a lot on things like photoshopping or masking CGI in the movies. It's the same principle of sound. I'm gonna run each layer of the beam through a thing called Tremolator. It's basically a plugin that automates the volume of your sound. You can connect it to MIDI inputs or LFOs or whatever the hell you want. It lets you create this kind of stutter effect. That was kind of a huge oversimplification, but whatever, you get it. We're also going to automate some different parts of this plugin to have it change throughout the course of the beam. This is going to help with that sense of movement that we were talking about earlier, and it's also going to help trick your brain into thinking that this is all one sound and not a bunch of different layers. And as an added bonus, I can slow down the oscillator at the end to help create the sense that this beam is sort of sputtering out, which adds to the whole DIY aspect of the design. Here's what it all sounds like when it's put together. Great, now that we've got the main body of our sound done, let's fill it out with some sweeteners. Specifically a whoosh, a tail, and a more defined transient. What's a transient? Great question. Basically, most sounds can be broken down into three parts: the transient, the body, and the tail. And sometimes there's also a whoosh, but not always. The transient is the loud impact part, so let's use a gunshot as an example. Can you guess what the transient is? Yeah, it's that. Basically, I just want the beam to have more impact, like a charge up, a whoosh, and then a bit of a kick when it first shoots out of the eye. To do this, I used a couple of things. One is just a straight sample library pull because I'm lazy. It's like this kick with some cool filtering and modulation on the end of it. I don't know, it sounded cool. I also made a whoosh, which I did with a plugin called Whoosh. Yeah, it does what it says on the tin. Basically, you can import your own sounds and set your own parameters, and it'll use a combination of effects and randomization to create a bunch of similar variations on the same kind of whoosh in a really short amount of time. I imported those beam layers I made, along with a couple of other things, and I just let it run for a bit while it generated a bunch of whooshes. Generally, it made things that sounded like this. So then I went through that whole file, and I settled on this one. I combined it with a riser sample that I swiped the high end from, put it all together, and now I've got this. Oh, right, and I also added the tail of an explosion to the end of the beam just to make it sound more powerful. All right, next we're gonna tackle that mech layer. The main elements I wanna cover here are all of the sounds that have to do with his special eye. First, let's just add some metal clicking and rattling. This will do a good job of conveying that his eye is rattling around and having a hard time containing all of the power that's running through it. I'm also gonna have this extend past the end of the beam, so it sounds like an old combustion engine cooling down. You know the sound when you turn your car off? Yeah, that. I'd also like it to sound like there's some kind of electrical discharge happening, so I pulled this sample of a giant Tesla coil going off. It's pretty cool, and it's also going to add some more interesting stuff to the high end, so it's not just that divine thing. Yeah. And finally, we need to cover the actual switch for when he activates his eye. It's just like a click sound. I wanted the sound to be complex and clicky, but also not too muddy. I ended up settling on some sounds from this old lockbox, a couple of library pulls from a turn signal and a calculating machine, and this weirdly satisfying ice cream scoop.
Oh my god, it's perfect.
Once everything was layered and glued together with some compression, it sounded like this. Perfect. The last layer was any additional Foley that I needed, and this actually ended up being the easiest one to do since it's a pretty simple animation. All I really needed to do was add some footsteps for when he lands back down on the ground, and some armor movement sounds. Delta wears scale mail, which is just a combination of leather and metal. It's pretty easy to find sounds for. And that's all the sounds I needed for the design. Now that everything's in place, all we really need to do is a bit of mixing. Make sure that everything is at the right level, glue it together with a bit of compression and saturation, drench it in reverb because I'm a hack fraud, and there it is, one special beam attack. And that's pretty much it. I know this was a very different kind of video, and I have no idea if this format is even interesting to someone who isn't into sound design or D&D or whatever, so if you made it all the way through, thank you, or if you skipped to the end, that's cool too, I won't judge. Either way, this was really fun to make, so if you enjoyed, please make sure to like, and if you have an Amazon Prime account, you can subscribe for free with Twitch Fuck, I messed it up again.